Daniel Worthington had built his empire on numbers, contracts, and unbending schedules. Every minute of his day was mapped out with precision, and every person around him existed only to serve a purpose in that grand order. His mansion reflected the same philosophy, gleaming marble that echoed with footsteps, windows so tall they stretched toward the ceiling, chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls of light. Everything was coldly perfect, a place designed not for comfort but for control. And in that environment, people blurred into function. The driver was a shadow behind the wheel, the butler a voice announcing arrivals, the maid a pair of hands that swept away the dust of existence. Daniel rarely knew their faces beyond a passing glance. To him, their identities were irrelevant as long as the house ran without flaw. Evelyn was one of those shadows, though different from the others in ways she never spoke about. She had been working in that house for nearly 4 years, long enough to know the rhythm of Daniel's life better than he knew it himself. His car would pull into the driveway at precisely 7:30 every evening unless business dinners delayed him. His shoes would be left by the door, jacket hung by the butler, drink placed in his hand without asking. By 8, he would be in his study, staring at screens or reports, and by 10:30 he would retire upstairs, not bothering to notice who had made the bed crisp and cold as steel. Evelyn understood this rhythm so deeply that she had built her own secret sanctuary inside of it. When the house fell into its predictable silence, when the master of the home was absent or lost in his study, Evelyn allowed herself a small rebellion. She sang. Softly at first, when she believed no one could hear, the melodies rising like warm air from her chest, carrying memories of a life far away. In Georgia, before hardship had hardened her, she had sung in a church choir with her mother. Music had been the one place where her voice mattered, where her existence felt larger than her labor. In the Worthington mansion, that voice had been locked away, but on rare evenings when the loneliness of the halls pressed too tightly, she freed it again. That Thursday began like any other. Daniel was scheduled for a late dinner with investors, one of those gatherings where cigars and false laughter filled the night. Evelyn knew she would have hours before he returned, so after cleaning the dining room and polishing the counters, she let herself exhale. She rinsed her rag, hung it neatly, and then, almost unconsciously, began to hum. The notes came slowly, like testing the water of a cold river, then stronger, warmer, until her voice spilled into the kitchen with a richness that surprised even her. It was not a song meant for others, it was a song meant for survival. But Daniel's meeting had imploded in a storm of harsh words and accusations. Investors had questioned his leadership, murmurs of betrayal filling the room, and he had left earlier than planned, fury gnawing at his chest. His driver said nothing during the ride home, wisely avoiding the cloud that hung over him. Daniel had wanted silence, his usual fortress of stillness where no one dared challenge him. Yet when he stepped through the door and dismissed the butler with a wave, the first thing he heard was not silence. It was a voice. He stopped in the hall, every nerve straining. It wasn't music from the stereo, nor the faint hum of a television. It was a human voice, carrying words he couldn't quite catch but weighted with something raw. He followed it like a man drawn by a thread, his polished shoes clicking against marble, until he reached the doorway to the kitchen. Evelyn stood at the counter, her back to him, unaware of his presence. She scrubbed at a spot on the marble, but her body moved gently with the rhythm of her song. It wasn't perfect, her voice trembled here and there, but each note was soaked with feeling. Daniel's chest tightened unexpectedly. He had not heard such unguarded singing in years. His late wife used to hum at night when she thought he was asleep, soft lullabies that carried their warmth even into his dreams. Evelyn's song was different, but it struck the same tender part of him he had buried beneath contracts and numbers. His eyes fixed on her, and for a moment he was not a millionaire but a man suddenly stripped of his armor. He leaned against the doorway, listening longer than he meant to, trying to swallow the rising ache in his throat. But then his shoe brushed against the marble baseboard with a faint scrape. Evelyn spun around so fast she nearly dropped the rag. Her eyes widened when she saw him standing there, face unreadable, shoulders straight. "Sir, I'm so sorry," she blurted out, her voice breaking. "I didn't expect you home so soon." Daniel said nothing. He simply stared, his expression caught between anger and something else she couldn't read. Evelyn's hands tightened around the rag, knuckles white, as fear coiled through her. She had broken the unspoken law of invisibility. She was not supposed to fill the air with her voice. She was supposed to serve in silence. She tried again, voice trembling. It won't happen again. Still no answer. His eyes scanned her as though searching for a truth he had overlooked all these years. The silence pressed heavier with each passing second until Evelyn felt her knees might give out. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice low, almost hoarse. Where did you learn to sing like that? The question stunned her. Of all the possible responses, anger, dismissal, even termination, she hadn't expected curiosity. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. For a heartbeat she considered lying, brushing it away, but the weight of his gaze demanded honesty. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, hesitating. His eyes didn't leave hers, and for the first time in 4 years of service she saw something fragile in them, something she hadn't thought a man like him possessed. The rag slipped from her hand and hit the counter. Her breath caught in her chest, and still she hadn't answered. The mansion's silence folded around them like a curtain, and the air grew thick with something that neither of them could name. And then, in that stillness, Evelyn realized the danger and the power of what had just happened. He had hurt her. Truly hurt her. Would he punish her for it, or was something far more unexpected about to begin? Evelyn's fingers twisted nervously in the cloth as she forced herself to meet his eyes. "Church choir, sir," she whispered, each word quiet enough to vanish in the cavernous kitchen. "Back home in Georgia. My mama made me sing every Sunday, whether I wanted to or not." Her lips curled into the faintest smile, quickly smothered by fear that it might look like defiance. Daniel tilted his head, studying her with a gaze so sharp it felt like he was peeling away layers she had kept hidden for years. His voice, when it came, was measured, but something inside it betrayed him. Why haven't I heard you before?" Her hands tightened around the rag until her knuckles ached. "Because you never came home early." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Honest. Too honest. Her chest burned with regret even as silence thickened between them. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not with rage but with the shock of someone hearing a truth spoken plainly for the first time. He straightened his posture, as though reclaiming the authority that had faltered for a moment. "This is my home," he said, tone hardening. "I don't pay for concerts in my kitchen." Her breath caught, shame flooding her cheeks with heat. "I didn't mean—" The sentence died when footsteps echoed behind her. The butler entered, holding Daniel's leather briefcase. "Sir, your documents from the meeting." He stopped mid-sentence, eyes flicking between Evelyn's flushed face and Daniel's frozen stance. The tension was heavy enough to crush the air. The butler lowered his gaze, lips tightening as though he understood something Evelyn didn't, and placed the briefcase on the counter with care. Daniel dismissed him with a curt nod. Evelyn's pulse hammered in her ears. She wanted to vanish into the shadows, return to the safety of invisibility, but she could feel his gaze still on her. A part of her braced for punishment, for words that would strip away what little dignity she had. Instead, he turned sharply and walked out, leaving her trembling in the middle of the kitchen. By morning, whispers swirled through the mansion. Servants who had seen the tension exchanged theories with sharp tongues. "The boss doesn't like noise," the cook muttered. "She should have known better." The gardener smirked. "Maybe she thinks she's somebody now, because he looked at her." Their laughter stung more than she cared to admit. Evelyn kept her eyes down, working faster than usual, swallowing every retort, every burn of humiliation. Silence had always been her shield. Daniel tried to bury himself in his work the next day, but the memory of that voice threaded through his concentration like a persistent melody. In meetings, while others spoke about projections and market trends, he drifted back to the sound of her singing. It unnerved him. It angered him. Why should a servant's voice cling to him when the voices of investors and partners faded like background noise? He tapped his pen against the desk, irritated at himself. That afternoon, While crossing the garden to his car, Daniel overheard a conversation that snapped him still. The gardener leaned against the wall, chuckling with the cook. "You hear her yesterday? Singing like she was in church. I thought angels were gonna fall through the ceiling." He laughed, cruel and sharp. "Bet she thinks she's Beyoncé now." The others snickered. Daniel's jaw tightened. He was about to walk on, tell himself it wasn't his concern, but a spark of something unfamiliar flared in him. Defense. Protection. He turned suddenly, voice like a whip. "Enough." They froze, faces draining of color. "Sir, we didn't mean." "I don't care what you meant. Get back to work." His glare left no room for argument. They scurried off. Daniel stood there longer than necessary, fists clenching at his sides. What unsettled him most wasn't their cruelty, it was his own reaction. Since when did he care what they said about Evelyn? She was a maid. Replaceable. A shadow in the machinery of his life. And yet, the thought of her shrinking under their mockery twisted something in his chest. That night he drank more than usual, nursing whiskey alone in his study. The house was quiet except for the occasional clink of glass against wood. He told himself it was stress from business, but he knew better. The song echoed in his head like a memory he didn't want but couldn't erase. His wife had once sung that same hymn when cancer had drained her strength but not her faith. Daniel had buried those nights deep, never letting anyone touch that wound. Evelyn's voice had cracked it open again. By Friday, the storm in his chest had not calmed. He paced through the halls, trying to outrun his thoughts. That evening, as he passed near the pantry, muffled voices drifted through the thin door. "Look at her, acting like she's special." The sneer was unmistakable. "Thinks the master's gonna put her on stage. She's just a maid." Another scoffed. "Needs to remember her place." A low laugh followed, dripping with venom. Daniel froze, every muscle tightening. He recognized the voices. The same staff who had mocked her in the garden now cornered her like vultures circling prey. He leaned closer, the sound of Evelyn's silence cutting sharper than any words. She wasn't defending herself. She was just enduring it. Rage swelled in him, hot and unfamiliar. His hand pressed against the doorframe, veins standing out, as he wrestled with himself. A part of him argued it wasn't his role to interfere, that a boss should remain above petty squabbles. But another voice, louder than reason, shouted that she didn't deserve this. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the weight of choice heavy on his chest. He could walk away and nothing would change. Evelyn would survive, as she always had, swallowing her pride and hiding her voice. Or he could step in, shatter the unspoken rules of his household, and face the consequences of what that meant. His hand trembled against the door. He closed his eyes, the sound of her stillness cutting him deeper than the laughter of the others. He thought of his wife's voice, of how Evelyn's song had stirred the ghosts he'd buried. And then his decision crystallized, burning in his chest. He pushed the door open so hard it slammed against the wall, making all three inside flinch. His shadow filled the pantry doorway, his eyes blazing like steel. The two staffers stumbled back, guilt splashed across their faces. Evelyn stood rigid, back straight, but her eyes were wide with shock. "What's going on here?" Daniel's voice was thunder, shaking the shelves of jars and cans. The room went silent except for the pounding of Evelyn's heart. And in that silence, she realized the master of the house had chosen. Daniel's presence in the pantry was like a storm breaking open. His voice cut through the air, sharp and heavy, and the two staffers who had moments before been laughing now stammered, pale as ghosts. One tried to speak, the words tumbling out clumsily. We were only out," Daniel said. His voice left no room for argument. It wasn't loud this time, but the weight of it struck harder than a shout. The two men glanced at each other, then at Evelyn, whose eyes were still wide, fixed on the floor. Without another word, they scuttled past Daniel and slipped out into the hall like guilty children. The door swung shut behind them, and the silence that followed pressed down heavier than before. Evelyn's breath trembled in her chest. She didn't look up, afraid that his anger would now turn toward her. But his footsteps didn't retreat. Instead, they moved closer, slow and deliberate, until she could feel the space between them tighten. "You didn't have to do that," she said at last, her voice so soft it might have been mistaken for a prayer. "Yes, I did." His tone surprised her. It wasn't the cold steel of a master correcting a servant. It was quieter, more human, as though something had broken inside of him. "I heard what they said." She looked up at him then, startled by the faint note of shame in his voice. For a moment their eyes locked, and she saw not the aloof man of wealth and power, but someone she couldn't quite recognize. Someone tired. Someone haunted. "Why didn't you defend yourself?" he asked, studying her face as if he were reading a story written in every line and crease. Her lips parted, but the answer caught in her throat. When she finally spoke, it was steady, though her eyes glistened. "Because in this house, sir, silence keeps me safe." The words struck him like a blade. He had always prided himself on running his estate with efficiency, on maintaining order. But here stood a woman who lived within his walls, working faithfully for years, believing her only safety lay in disappearing, in swallowing her pride and hiding her voice. He had built a prison without realizing it. Daniel lowered himself onto a stool by the shelves, shoulders heavy, his hands clasped together, as if bracing against the weight of her truth. For a long moment he said nothing, and Evelyn stood frozen, unsure if she should retreat or remain. Then his voice, rough and uneven, broke the silence. "Sing." Her brow furrowed. "Sir?" "Sing," he repeated, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that was both command and plea. "Right now." Her breath caught. She didn't know if this was a trap, some test to humiliate her further. But something in his eyes told her otherwise. He looked fragile in a way she had never seen before. Slowly, hesitantly, she parted her lips. At first the sound wavered, a timid echo of the strength she usually held back. But as she watched him close his eyes, as though he were bracing himself against something deep inside, courage bloomed in her chest. The notes rose fuller, richer, filling the pantry with warmth that pushed against the cold marble of the mansion. The hymn swelled, a melody born from years of buried pain and stubborn hope, a voice that carried all the things she could never say out loud. Daniel sat perfectly still, but his hands trembled slightly where they rested on his knees. The song was more than music to him, it was memory. It pulled him back to nights long ago, when his wife had lain in bed, frail but radiant, humming that very melody in the dark. He remembered lying beside her, eyes open, listening to her voice steady his breath even as her own life slipped away. He remembered the night her singing stopped, and the silence that had taken root in him ever since. Evelyn's voice pierced that silence, cracking it open like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. He tried to hold it back, but tears blurred his vision until he bowed his head, his shoulders shaking under the weight of grief he had never allowed himself to release. When her song ended, the room was unbearably quiet. Evelyn's heart hammered. She had seen him as untouchable for so long that watching him cry now felt like glimpsing a secret the world was not meant to know. "I'm sorry," she whispered, unsure why she said it. Maybe because she thought her singing had wounded him. Maybe because she had seen him fall apart. He shook his head quickly, wiping at his face with the back of his hand. "Don't apologize." His voice cracked. "That song, my wife used to sing it. At night. Before the cancer took her." The admission hung in the air, fragile and raw. Evelyn's lips parted, shock flickering across her face. I didn't know. No one knew." His words were thick, as though dragged from the depths of his chest. "I never told anyone. Not once." He buried his face in his hands again, and the sound of his uneven breathing filled the small room. Evelyn's instinct was to retreat, to give him the privacy of his grief, but something stronger pulled her forward. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she dared to rest it gently on his arm. For once, he didn't pull away. The touch was light, but it anchored him, tethering him to the present when his mind wanted to drown in memory. He turned his face slightly, not fully meeting her eyes but no longer hiding either. The strength she had shown in her silence, the compassion in her singing, it cut deeper than any business deal or victory he had ever won. "Do you know what that means?" he asked after a long pause, his voice low and unsteady. "Hearing it again? After all this time?" Evelyn shook her head slowly. "I can only imagine, sir. It means," he said, staring at the floor as if afraid of his own words, "that I've been dead in my own house for years. And tonight you reminded me what it feels like to be alive." The confession lingered between them, heavy with truth. Evelyn didn't know how to respond. She had never thought of herself as someone capable of reaching a man like him. Yet here he was, broken open not by power or wealth, but by a psalm carried in the heart of a maid who had learned long ago to stay silent. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them both glance toward the door, but Daniel didn't move. For the first time, he seemed unconcerned with appearances, with what others might think if they saw him like this. He sat there, raw and human, his walls shattered. Evelyn kept her hand where it was, steady, unshaken now. In her presence, he didn't feel the need to armor himself. And in that fragile moment, Daniel Worthington, the millionaire who had lived behind marble walls and iron discipline, realized that the maid he had overlooked for years had given him something no one else could, the courage to feel again. Morning broke with a thin stripe of gold peeling across the long windows, but the house did not feel like it used to. The air carried a different weight, less of the polished stillness that had once smothered the halls, more of a quiet expectancy, as if the rooms themselves were holding their breath. He stood at the landing of the staircase longer than usual, one hand on the rail, listening to the soft stirrings of work beginning, the clink of china, the roll of a cart, the distant whir of a vacuum. Somewhere below, a kettle sighed. He drew a breath that filled his lungs in a way he had not felt in years, then descended. He summoned everyone to the grand hall not with a bell or an order barked through the butler, but by stepping into the center of the marble floor and speaking in a normal voice. Staff gathered from the kitchen, the pantry, the garden doors. Some arrived curious, others anxious, a few tight-lipped with the habitual wariness that came from working beneath unyielding roofs. She stood near the back, hands folded, eyes steady but cautious, ready to be small if smallness would protect her. He looked at each of them as if seeing them for the first time. The faces that had blurred to functions were people, the cook's red knuckles and kind, impatient mouth, the gardener's sun-creased brow, the housekeeper whose spine carried the weight of 1,000 lists. And her quiet strength braided through every line of her posture. He let the silence settle long enough for them to wonder. "There has been disrespect in this house," he said, voice even. The words traveled up to the chandelier and back down, leaving no corner untouched. "Not the noisy kind you can scold and be done with, but the kind that teaches people to shrink. That kind grows unless it's cut at the root." He paused, feeling his own reflection in the polished floor. For a flicker he saw a man who had worn power like armor and mistook silence for peace. "It ends now." Throats tightened. Eyes flicked. No one spoke. He continued. "There will be changes. First, anyone found belittling another here will answer to me, personally. Second, wages are adjusted to reflect the value you bring. Back pay will be calculated where I've fallen short. Third, this is not a house of fear. If you've been holding your tongue because you thought it kept you safe, I need to earn back the right to hear it." The butler shifted, surprised. The cook glanced at the gardener. A murmur rolled, then quieted as he lifted a hand. "And one more thing," he said, turning until his gaze found her. "You reminded me of something I buried. You didn't mean to. You were simply being yourself in a moment the house wasn't watching. But you changed the air I breathe." His voice roughened. "Thank you?" A subtle tremor crossed her face, there and gone, like a ripple moving under still water. She lowered her eyes, not because she felt small, but because the recognition landed too full in her chest for a steady gaze to carry it. He dismissed the staff, but asked her to stay. The hall emptied in a shuffle of footsteps and half-held glances, leaving the two of them in a thinner, gentler quiet. He gestured toward the side salon where morning light brushed a piano he had not opened since the day it was tuned for a soul that never returned to play it. He sat on the bench without touching the keys. She remained standing, hands gathered, as if any surface in this room might not belong to her. I was a man who measured everything, he said, studying the black and ivory teeth of the instrument. If I could quantify it, I could control it. Then I lost the one thing I couldn't measure. After that, I started measuring people, too. It felt safer. He turned to her. I won't ask you to forgive that. I will ask for a chance to live differently under the same roof. Her answer did not come as words. It came as a slow nod, the kind that carried more weight than a speech. But after a moment, her voice found a path. Sometimes we hide what keeps us alive because we think it will offend the person who owns the room, she said. I didn't want to offend the room. He swallowed, then lifted the fallboard and pressed one key, soft enough to barely sound. A plain note trembled into the air. I've been thinking of a foundation in my wife's name, he said. Music scholarships. Choir grants. Programs for people who sing in rooms that are not built to listen. He met her eyes. I'd like you to help me build it. Paid time. Real authority. Not a gesture. She blinked, stunned into stillness. Me? You, he said. If you'll say yes. She looked at the piano, at the morning light, at the man whose grief had finally stopped pretending to be marble. I don't have degrees, she said, almost apologetic. You have what I don't, he replied. A voice that remembers why voices matter. Her breath shook with a laugh that was almost a sob. Then, yes, she said, barely above a whisper. I'll help. The day moved differently after that. The cook's instructions lost their edge. The gardener paused to ask if the hydrangeas near the east wall should be moved to catch more sun. The housekeeper knocked before entering a room instead of sliding through like a well-oiled hinge. It wasn't dramatic. It was better. It was ordinary but kinder. By evening, he asked her to stay a little longer. Not to clean, not to set a tray, but to sit in the music room with the door half open and talk details, budgets, partners, timelines. She listened, asked precise questions, wrote neat notes in a small notebook that had previously held grocery orders and stain removal tricks. At one point, she lifted her head and said, If we fund a choir, we should fund the shoes too. People forget the shoes. He smiled with a kind of awe. We'll fund the shoes. On Sunday, he unlocked the heavy doors of a small chapel on the edge of the property grounds, a place he had avoided like a mirror. Dust rose like incense as the hinges gave. Wooden pews waited under colored glass. He stood in the threshold, unsure, until he heard footsteps behind him and felt her presence as a quiet that didn't ask him to be anything he wasn't. Would you sing here? He asked, hesitant as a boy. Just a little. Not for me only. For this room. She stepped forward, walked to the center aisle, and faced the empty space. No performance stance, no flourish. Just a woman standing inside her own breath. The first note was barely there, a thread. Then the thread thickened, braided itself with memory, with faith learned in old wooden buildings where hope had to be loud enough to drown a week's worth of trouble. Her voice swept the chapel, and the colored windows answered, pooling reds and blues across the floor, pouring light over the simple altar like a blessing spilled and not yet cleaned. He sat in the last pew and let his chest rise and fall around the sound. He did not hide his tears. They were not a collapse this time but a release, the body learning water again. When the last note shivered itself to silence, she did not move for a breath, then turned, and in the quiet their eyes met with an acknowledgement that needed no language. Word of the foundation began as a rumor that Monday and became a fact by Friday. A press release went out that did not center him as benefactor so much as it named the purpose in plain terms: to uplift the unseen voices that keep houses running and still carry songs home. He requested that no ribbon be cut, no grand gala thrown. Instead, he wrote checks with steady hands and asked her to decide where the first ones belong. She chose 3 programs: a community choir with failing risers and broken stands, a school with more talent than instruments, and a church whose roof leaked onto the alto section in thunder season. He added a 4th in secret, a stipend line item labeled shoes. There were missteps. Not everyone liked the change. The two staff who had cornered her in the pantry received formal warnings and mandatory training. One resigned rather than attend. The kitchen bristled for a week, a clatter of wounded pride, until the cook burned a sauce, muttered an apology to no one in particular, and the air loosened. She kept working as before, beds made, floors shining, but something foundational had shifted. She no longer shrank. She chose when to be quiet and when to speak. Sometimes, passing the long windows in the late afternoon, she hummed just loud enough for the glass to carry the line outside to the hydrangeas. He visited the music room in the evenings now, not to chase ghosts but to greet them. He took lessons, awkward at first, from a teacher who did not care about his net worth and corrected his wrists with cheerful brutality. On one night that felt like spring had rushed the calendar, he played the melody she had once sung alone in the kitchen. His hands were clumsy but earnest. She listened with the kind of gentleness that doesn't condescend and joined him, her voice steadying his uncertain pace. The house, which had learned to hold grief like a breath trapped in the chest, exhaled. The first check presentation happened not on a stage but on a Tuesday in a sleepy multipurpose room that smelled of dust and lemon cleaner. Children fidgeted in metal chairs. A custodian leaned on a broom and cried quietly when he thought no one would notice. She spoke to the kids about showing up, even when the room isn't listening yet, even when your song scares the quiet. He stood in the back, hands in his pockets, an expression on his face that looked like humility wearing unfamiliar clothes and finding that, surprisingly, they fit. Weeks passed. The foundation's name started to circulate on flyers, then on whispers of gratitude that don't make headlines but rewire lives. The mansion's routines continued, but without the old bite. People said good morning and meant it. Laughter returned to the hallways in small, necessary measures. On one unremarkable afternoon, the gardener brought in a single hydrangea bloom and set it in a jar by the sink. No note. No apology. Just color. Late one evening, he came home earlier than usual again. The sky was still blue at the edges, and the house was awake but comfortable, like a body at rest with its eyes open. He walked through the door and paused in the same hall where everything had first tilted. From the kitchen drifted the faintest thread of melody, unafraid and unhidden. Not loud, not a performance. A woman singing to the rhythm of her work, to the rhythm of her life, to the rhythm of a house that finally listened. He did not hide in the doorway this time. He stepped into the light and let the sound meet him. She turned, saw him, and did not flinch. He nodded once, a greeting that contained a dozen thank yous and one promise. She smiled, not as a servant seeking permission but as a person standing whole in her place. "If you keep coming home early," she said, a teasing warmth in her tone, "you're going to learn that song properly." "I'm trying," he answered, and they both understood he meant more than music. He poured water, not whiskey. He set a glass by the sink for her, then leaned against the counter and listened to the last verse unwind. Outside, night gathered into something gentle. Inside, the house stood the way a chest stands after a sob, emptied of pressure, filled with breath. What happened that first night could not be undone, but it did not need to be. It had become the hinge on which everything turned, a man coming home early, a voice refusing to die, a cry that cleansed rather than consumed. He had thought control was his fortress. It turned out to be his prison. She had thought silence was her safety. It turned out to be her cage. Together, without meaning to, they unlocked a door neither could find alone. When she finished, the quiet that followed felt like a blessing landing softly on the countertop. He set his glass down and said, with a steadiness that surprised him, "Thank you for bringing my house back to life." She shook her head gently. "You did that by listening." He smiled, eyes bright. "Then I'll keep listening." And under the soft hum of a home unafraid of its own echoes, the promise held, simple, human, and enough.